Well, good morning, everyone. As Cynthia mentioned, our session today will focus on hotspots policing, which, as I think all of you know, has been a very important policing innovation of the last few decades. The use of crime analysis to identify areas of crime concentration or hotspots to guide police operations is now very common among police agencies, and there's a fair amount of research suggesting that geographically focused police operations are effective. But questions still remain about some of the most effective strategies for agencies to use at hotspots and how best police can implement and manage these operations. So in our session today, we want to try to address three questions. One is, what should police be doing at hotspots? What are the best strategies to use? Second, how do you incorporate hotspots policing into your regular practices? And third, what challenges will you encounter and how do you try to overcome them? So I'll start off by reviewing some of the evidence on effective strategies for police to use at hotspots, and then Deputy Chief Aden and Sergeant Egge will discuss some of the experiences of their agencies with implementing hotspots policing. So by way of some background, hotspots policing refers generally to police interventions focused on small areas or very specific places where crime is concentrated. There's no standard definition of the term hotspot, but it's typically used particularly by researchers to refer to very specific addresses, intersections, street blocks, and clusters of blocks where crime is concentrated. Research done in a number of cities has shown that about half of crime occurs at 5% or less of the street blocks and addresses in a city. Now, these locations tend to be nodes for various business, leisure, and travel activities. They tend to be places with facilities and features that create criminal opportunities and put them at higher risk. They include places with locations like bars, convenience stores, parks, apartment buildings, and the like. And it's thought that police can be more effective and more efficient in a number of ways by focusing their efforts on these places. For one, you're concentrating on the places where crime is most likely to occur. Second, you can arguably generate a more visible presence and have greater perceptual effects in the small space of a hotspot than over larger areas. And by focusing on these very small locations, it may be easier for police to identify and change some of the conditions that contribute to crime problems at these locations using techniques like situational crime prevention or working with managers of key establishments at these places. There have been a number of studies to date indicating that police interventions focused on hotspots tend to reduce crime and disorder at those locations, and often in surrounding areas, and usually with no obvious signs of crime displacement. This slide shows results from a review of several hotspot studies that was done a number of years ago by Anthony Braga of Harvard University. There have been additional studies since that time that also support the effectiveness of hotspots policing. Evidence compiled from the evidence-based policing matrix that Cynthia and Howard discussed shows that police interventions focused on places tend to have higher success rates than those focused on people. And even when looking at place-based interventions, police tend to be a bit more successful when they focus on smaller micro hotspots as opposed to larger areas like neighborhoods and patrol beats. So in general, we have a fair amount of evidence that hotspots policing is effective. So that raises the question of, okay, what should police do at hotspots? And in prior studies, police have used a wide variety of interventions, ranging from directed patrol and fixed police presence to intensified enforcement activities to problem-solving activities, often stressing things like situational crime prevention, nuisance abatement, cleanup activities, and a variety of other measures. In my discussion today, though, I want to focus on two primary issues. One is concentrating patrol on hotspots, and the other is complementing that with problem-oriented policing focused on hotspots. So starting with the use of directed patrol at hotspots, a good illustration of this was a study that was done in Minneapolis a number of years ago by Lawrence Sherman and David Weisberg, who is on the faculty here at GMU. And working with the police in Minneapolis, they identified 110 small hotspots. These were clusters of high crime addresses. And over the course of a one-year period, they assigned half of these locations to receive intensified patrol. Basically, officers responsible for these locations were told to spend as much time as they could at these particular locations when they were not answering calls for service. Now, what they did at the locations was up to them. They could just sit there if nothing else, but the main goal, the overriding purpose, was just to increase police presence at these locations. And over the course of the 1-year period, they were generally able to spend about 2 to 3 hours per day at these locations. And their analysis showed that this helped to reduce crime and disorder at the experimental hotspots. As you can see here, calls about hard crime, more serious crimes, went down in the experimental locations that got the extra patrol while remaining unchanged in the other ones. Other types of calls went up in both sets of locations, but note that they went up by much less in the places that got the additional patrol as compared to the other locations. So this project, in a very simple, straightforward way, demonstrated some of the benefits of trying to focus patrol operations around these micro hotspot locations. Now, this may raise, though, a number of practical considerations for an agency. Of course, you need to spread your resources across a large number of hotspots. Officers may also be resistant to spending long periods of time just sitting on these locations, and indeed they ran into some of that when they were doing the Minneapolis study. So 3 questions that might come to mind are, well, how often should police try to stop at these hotspots? How long should they remain there each time they stop? And how much total time should they try to log in hotspots each day? We don't yet have the research base to provide precisely calibrated answers to all of these questions, but I do want to focus on this second one, which is one that I looked at in a study that utilized data from the Minneapolis experiment. And basically, I wanted to see if longer stops, longer police presences at hotspots had greater residual effects. That is, did they lead to longer periods without crime and disorder even after the police left? So in other words, would a longer stop be more likely to drive away troublesome persons and affect the behavior of other peoples around the location after they left? At the same time, I also wanted to see if there was a point of diminishing returns to this effect. Was there a point at which it was not worthwhile for the police to stay at the hotspot any longer? Now, I looked at these issues using data on approximately 17,000 instances when police either drove through or stopped at a hotspot in Minneapolis. And what I found can be represented in this graphic here, and this is what Howard was making reference to in the last presentation. I looked at police presences of up to 20 minutes in length, represented down here along the bottom. And this vertical axis represents the effects on crime and disorder, with a larger number representing a larger effect. And what I found was that, as expected, when police stayed at a hotspot for a longer period of time, they exerted greater effects on crime and disorder. But if they stayed much longer than 15 minutes, they seemed to bring diminishing returns. The effect kind of leveled off and seemed to downturn a bit. So it seemed that in these data, the optimal length of time, if you will, for police to sit on a hotspot appeared to be about 15 minutes. Now, some of my colleagues in the field have, over the years, taken to calling this the Koper curve. So if you ever hear that expression, that's where it comes from, and you'll see an illustration in Alexandria of the agency using this. For the record, no, I did not name it after myself. It was my colleagues that did that. So, sure.
What did the officers do when they stopped in those hotspots? Did you get any of that data from the
That was not in here, but they did a wide variety of things. I mean, sometimes they might get out and talk to people and do different things. They might do proactive activities like field interviews, traffic stops. They might just do other friendly discussions with people. Other times they may have just sat in their car. It was really up to them what they did. The overriding purpose in this experiment was just to increase visible police presence at these locations and to get them there as much as possible. So they didn't really try to force them to do any particular thing. They just wanted to focus the patrol time there. So this analysis is just irrespective of what they were doing. It was just looking at the time they spent there. Okay. To give you a more concrete illustration of what this means, this chart shows the likelihood that some kind of a crime or disorderly behavior would occur within 30 minutes of police leaving a hotspot. And this is based on observational data that were collected as part of the Minneapolis experiment. And you can see this contrasted for instances when they drove through the hotspot and instances when they stayed for 11 to 15 minutes. As you can see, the likelihood of disorder was greatly reduced by about 75% when they stayed for 11 to 15 minutes as opposed to simply driving through. So the implications of this is that police may be able to maximize the deterrent effects of patrol by having officers make periodic stops of roughly about 15 minutes at their hotspots when they're not answering calls for service. And they could try to mix this up and hit these places on kind of a random, intermittent basis throughout their shifts. And this might provide a way for police to try to reorient their everyday patrol activities around these micro hotspots that cause a great deal of crime and disorder. So moving beyond patrol, what are some other things that agencies can do at hotspots? And in prior studies, police have used a wide variety of interventions. I have a number of them listed here. They range from things like targeted investigations to cleanup activities to nuisance abatement. But when you look through a lot of these studies, a commonality that often emerges is problem analysis and the development of responses tailored to the specific problems at a given hotspot. And so I want to use this as a transition into discussing the application of problem-oriented policing to crime hotspots. Now, there have been a number of studies looking at POP at hotspots, but I want to illustrate this using results from a recent study that my colleagues and I at PERF conducted with the Jacksonville, Florida Sheriff's Office, in which we looked at the effects of problem solving on violent crime hotspots. And we also contrasted the effects of problem solving at hotspots with those of an intensive saturation patrol initiative that was done at hotspots. So this gave us a way of comparing these two strategies and trying to develop some more refined evidence on the effectiveness of different types of hotspot strategies relative to one another. So just running through this very quickly, working with crime analysts in Jacksonville, we identified 83 hotspots of non-domestic or street violence using data over a multiple year period. These were rather small locations averaging about 0.02 square miles in size. They were responsible for about 13% of the violent crimes in the city. This gives you an overview of just a small number of the hotspots. As you can see, they're shaded in blue and green and yellow. They were generally clusters of high crime blocks. And we assigned these locations to one of three conditions for an experiment that ran from January through April of 2009. 22 of them were assigned to a problem-oriented policing condition, 21 to a saturation patrol intervention, and 40 just served as control hotspots where police continue just normal everyday operations. The problem-oriented policing intervention involved assigning teams of officers and crime analysts to each one of these spots. In total, Jacksonville dedicated 60 officers and 4 analysts to the effort. It was a short-term but very intensive intervention. The teaming of the officers and crime analysts was something that was innovative and I think got very good feedback from the officers. They found it very helpful to work with crime analysts in diagnosing and addressing the problems. And they were all given responsibility for coming up with responses, both enforcement and non-enforcement responses to deal with the issues that they discovered at these locations and trying to employ community partners wherever possible as well. Officers engaged in a wide variety of problem-solving activities at the locations. We developed this coding scheme actually with the help of Sergeant Eggy, who was with us as a research fellow last year. We categorized about 40% of their activities as falling into the category of situational crime prevention. So that could be things like improving lighting or other physical security measures at particular locations. Other interventions included enhancing social services around the location, making aesthetic improvements in the environment, code enforcement and nuisance abatement, community organizing work, targeted investigation and enforcement, working with local businesses, and also working with rental property managers on things like evicting problem tenants. Overall, officers conducted about 280 different problem-solving activities during this time. Again, it was a short-term but very intensive intervention. The saturation patrol intervention involved assigning additional officers at the saturation spots at high-risk times as determined by Jacksonville's Crime Analysis Unit. They would look at days of the week and particular hours that were most at risk. Typically, a pair of officers in 2 cars would together have responsibility for 1 to 3 hotspots that were in fairly close proximity, and they would work these for a period maybe ranging from a few hours to several hours. They were not using the 15-minute stop principle. It was a more intensive saturation patrol intervention. The dosage averaged about 53 officer hours per week per spot. As you can see here, they, in addition to intensively patrolling, they engaged in proactive activities like door-to-door contacts, traffic stops, pedestrian checks, and the like. And then just to give you the bottom line on the results, we saw indications that crime was reduced in the saturation areas during the intervention period, but those effects quickly decayed. Basically, crime rebounded in those areas when the patrols were over. On the other hand, we saw evidence of larger and more lasting effects associated with problem solving at the locations. Serious crimes, serious violent crimes were reduced by up to a third, according to different measures that we looked at, and these effects were apparent after the intervention period was over, so they seemed to be more like long-term prevention effects that would, in principle, last indefinitely. Also saw some indications that they were more effective in terms of crimes prevented per officer hour when doing the problem solving. We have some ongoing analyses that suggest that some of the most effective types of problem solving activities were those associated with things like nuisance abatement and code enforcement, targeted investigation, and situational crime prevention. That's based on a preliminary ongoing analysis. One caveat is that we did see some indications of spikes in calls for service in areas surrounding the problem-solving locations that could represent some displacement, but there were also patterns in the data suggesting that it might be reporting effects, that it may be that people in these nearby areas became more likely to call the police as a result of the problem-solving activities that were going on nearby. But just as a caveat, it's just something that police agencies should be vigilant about. They should be on the watch for any possible displacement or reporting effects in nearby areas when doing these hotspots initiatives. Finally, I just want to wrap up with a few comments about implementing hotspots policing based on these studies as well as a number of others. One is that it helps to do geographic crime analysis based on both recent and long-term crime patterns. Hotspots are often stable over long periods of time, and you'll see that in Sergeant Egge's presentation. So it's good to, in addition to looking at the most recent spikes, to also look at some of these long-term problematic locations. Also, as I mentioned earlier, it may be helpful for police to think about reorienting everyday patrol operations around hotspots. Officers are always accustomed to thinking in terms of neighborhoods and patrol beats, but it may be useful to encourage them to focus more on the small locations within those areas that generate the most problems, perhaps using a tactic like making 15-minute stops periodically at those locations throughout their shifts. And then at the same time, police can complement that with problem solving at hotspots to achieve, I think, larger and longer-term crime reductions that can include both short-term and long-term responses. So a short-term response might be something like a targeted enforcement initiative, whereas the long-term measures might stress more prevention, might be things like situational crime prevention, nuisance abatement, and the like. And also, it often enhances these interventions to get other agencies involved as well. And then finally, I think this can also be facilitated by collecting better data on places. Police agencies, of course, collect a lot of data on people, but crime is actually more predictable by place than by people. And so it would be helpful to have more information on just some of the long-term problems at these locations and some of the things that have been tried at those locations to deal with those problems. And then for those of you who are interested in seeing additional examples of hotspots policing, as Cynthia mentioned earlier, the matrix is available online, and so you can look at a wide variety of hotspot studies that have been done, and a number of them are also mentioned in your notebook.